Something I'm looking forward to. Oh, thanks, Craig. One thing I'm looking forward to is I get to take my daughter this weekend to her first big concert. And so I'm looking forward. She just turned 13, which is wild, having a 13-year-old now, but getting to get to go this weekend to share that experience with her. I'm definitely looking forward and very excited about that. And yes, welcome to the Texas Balanced State Continuum of Care Written Standards for Service Delivery Updates webinar. We appreciate you joining us. If there are members of your team that weren't able to make it today, we are recording this webinar and we will make it available so that you can follow up. Just if you need a refresher of the information we're sharing today, or if you need other people on your teams to be able to review it as well. All right, if we can go to the next slide, Dusty. Want to give a just a brief content warning. Later on in the presentation, there will be some content that contains information about serving victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, and other forms of gender-based violence. So while today's slides do not contain explicit imagery or language, content does not need to be explicit to be triggering. So please feel encouraged, y'all, and welcome to take breaks if needed, if any of the content it feels triggering for you. So just want to take a moment to introduce our team. And so we are the CoC program planning staff team at Texas Homeless Network. And kind of when we talk about the Texas Balanced State CoC staff, very often at least for CoC program and ESG grantees, that's our team. So my name is Billy Strew. I am the director of planning for the planning staff here at Texas Homeless Network, and I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
My name is Dusty Worrell. I'm the Planning and Policy Coordinator at THN.
Hi, my name is Marcel Rivers. I'm the Planning and Engagement Coordinator.
Excellent. And then Dusty will be presenting on some things a little bit later, and Marcel will be in the chat, kind of fielding questions that can be answered, and then just sharing links throughout the presentation as well, as certain resources get discussed. So today's agenda, we're going to go over just some of the updates that have recently happened to the written standards for service delivery for the Texas Balanced State Continuum of Care. These are updates that have been in consideration for probably more than a year, but just because of all kinds of things going on, including competition and just a lot of different things, it is typically a slow process and ended up being even slower. But these updates have been officially approved by the CoC board in February. And so we are wanting to, instead of just assuming that everybody will just read through the new updated written standards on their own, we wanted to be able to provide this webinar to present to you. So the purposes of today's webinar is not necessarily a training over the written standards, but more just kind of trying to make you aware of what the specific changes are that are in updates within the written standards. So some of these that we'll be discussing today is our monitoring strategy being added to the written standards, a new section on joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing projects for their program requirements, update to the Category 4 homeless definition, as well as just some updates with our emergency transfer plan. And then we'll end and try to leave some time for Q&A for anybody that may have questions in this time.
All right, thanks, Billy. So just real quick, my mic may cut in and out. I'm having some IT issues with it. If that happens, just put in the chat you need me to repeat something, and I'll do my best to monitor that while I present. So today I'm going to cover the strategies that we just added, through 68, and it has contents on desk/remote review, on-site monitoring, quarterly scorecards, quality review plans, and self-monitoring. Excuse me. So monitoring strategies at a glance. So starting off with on-site monitorings, these are considered by being conditionally included in our CoC competition. But they can also be triggered if there are other concerns for performance, or if there was a complaint filed by a participant to either us at THN or HUD. An on-site monitoring typically will contain file reviews, a financial review, a review of the grant administration process that you all have, the recipient documentations that might be there. For us, we typically will follow a HUD monitoring strategy approach. So it's very similar to when HUD would come in and do a monitoring. We use the HUD monitoring exhibits that I have linked later on in the slide at our. So next is desk/remote reviews. These are very similar to on-site monitoring, but the scope is much smaller. The focus is on participant file, specifically the participant who filed a complaint, as well as comparing policies and procedures that were compared to the appropriate monitoring exhibits. This may result in triggering an on-site monitoring, but it just depends on what's discovered and what assistance we think is additionally needed. So quarterly scorecards, this only affects those individuals who can get funded through the CoC program. So not everyone in the BoS CoC gets experience the joy of a quarterly scorecard. They basically wants to objectively evaluate CoC funded programs. We base these scores based on reports pulled from HIS and SAGE. Also update the scorecards regularly to reflect current LOFOs, as well as any priority shifts or changes that we do here at THN. So quality review plans are more aimed towards individual agencies that are going to do the CoC. So again, these are for people who are agencies who are conditionally included in the current CoC competition. The goal here is to agencies and helping improve compliance and performance. Usually that results in us meeting monthly just to review progress towards goals. The goals are really driven by specific agencies, and we provide guidance to help them reach their goals. So lastly, we have self-monitoring, which is the biggest one that affects pretty much everybody. So self-monitoring, these are specifically where we are asking that projects review their participant files quarterly, as well as the primary support staff, so like your case managers, housing navigators, to conduct file reviews regularly, in compliance with the record-keeping requirements. While we ask supervisory staff that they conduct an annual review of everything, just to make sure everything's in compliance and there's not a major issue that's spotted or not spotted and it goes on for a little while, causing potential issues. Yes, this will be shared on too. Apologies if I'm going too fast. And lastly, with self-monitoring, if there's discovery of a non-resolvable file deficiency, agencies just need to create a memo to file, explain what the problem is and the steps involved to resolve it. If the issue continues, the project should seek guidance from HUD or THN, or HUD field rep or us at THN, so that we can help you. Kind of just expanding a little bit on self-monitoring. This is the most important piece here, because this allows you to catch yourself first before it follows up, and those are not an if. Kind of like what the comic says, I'm self-awareness. Sorry. Hi, I'm your self-awareness. Yikes. You seem afraid. Look behind you. I'm your self-awareness awareness. So it's kind of following the process of how a monitoring is kind of similar, right? Internal monitoring, right? It stresses case managers out a little bit. Oh man, I might have forgotten something. Then we're the second panel where we're now stepping in doing a monitoring, and then finally HUD doing a monitoring as well. But these are nothing to worry about in general. It's all the time, but self-monitoring is important. So these can look like things as review. So case managers review each other's files and then provide a list of deficiencies to each other so that they can correct. This could look like case managers themselves just doing their own file review routinely. Supervisors could be setting dates and timelines to where then they'll review the files to correct the deficiencies are corrected. And then finally, the annual reviews are just reviewing all the files that were in the program or still in the program at the end of the year. So that was our very brief section on monitoring strategies. Again, like Billy said, we're not going into too much detail about most of these. So I encourage you to review what's in the written standards and then reach out to us if you have any questions. Moving on to joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing. So this is from pages 52 to 59. So this combines transitional housing and rapid rehousing into one program. And what's different than traditional rapid rehousing or transitional housing is recipients should be offering 2 times as much rapid rehousing as they would. And finally, grant funds can be used for fixing and operating costs to provide transitional. Do you want to take over? It seems like my mic is just going downhill now.
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that. Yeah, we've been working on audio and it's a troubleshooting with the computer, and so we're yeah, no, we appreciate you bringing that up, Benjamin. Yes, I can go ahead and take over on this one. And so you can see grant funds can be used for leasing and operating costs to provide transitional housing, tenant-based rental assistance for the rapid rehousing portion of the project, and for supportive services, HMIS, and project administrative costs. So with the joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing projects, important, in this section, in the written standards before, we've always had program requirements, which required by of a CoC for the different project types. And so there's kind of a similar format for all of the projects of permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing. So in the same fashion, this new section for joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing is kind of going through the similar format. So it goes over eligibility. Households must qualify for under homelessness definition of category 1 or category 4. Prioritization. Seems that CoC funded projects must prioritize households who are unsheltered, experiencing long or multiple episodes of homelessness, with high barriers to exiting homelessness, and that are more likely to be a victim of violence or harm. So for the essential project elements that are listed, housing identification is listed in the written standards now for this project type, responsible for locating housing options with households and address potential barriers to landlord participation. Justin, you want to try to come in and see if it works better?
All right, can everybody hear me a little better now?
I think so. Let's give it a try.
Yeah, it's way
All right.
better.
Again, okay, good. Again, if there's a break in my audio, just let us know again. Like I said, it's been an ongoing issue for a while. So going on to the essential project elements for joint transition rapid rehousing programs or housing identification. This is basically saying that agencies who are using this program type are responsible for assisting assisting their participants with locating housing options. Right. This is specifically saying that you can't just be like, all right, you're in our program. Good luck. Go find your own housing, and we'll step in to talk to the landlord if we need to. Nope, you should be walking them through the steps. Many may not know how to really look for housing anymore if they've been homeless for a long time. Plus, they may just also have a lot of anxiety and fear about, trying to communicate with a landlord or property manager on their own right off the. This also is important to help with identifying potential barriers to landlord participation. I'm sure we all can have tons of stories about landlords who essentially don't want to house anyone who's experiencing homelessness for one reason or another because of a bad experience, misunderstandings. They may even misunderstand the type of funding sources that is being used to help cover the rent. So there may be some trepidation there. So it's a big step across requirement to really, help ease those anxieties and reduce those barriers to landlords. So low barrier, right? This is the simplest way to put this is you want to screen in, don't screen out. And for those who aren't aware of what that phrase means, essentially you're not screening for potential issues in somebody. So you're not looking at their criminal record, you're not looking at their credit score, things like that. You're not going to look at, do they have their ID already? You're looking more at, okay, what can we do to bring them into the program, right? You're focusing on what you can do to help them. Essentially, it means that in most situations, you should be accepting everybody except for like those extreme egregious situations. Like previously, they might have made threats towards staff or other participants where they may have to result in a barring for a little while. The goal is to not deny people assistance if they qualify. So housing first, this is a best practice that we encourage all agencies to use. So I'm just going to kind of leave it there. There's a little bit more explanation to it in our written standards, but hopefully most of you all are aware of what housing first is. So I'm not able to really answer that right now, Gustavo. I know here at Teach, we're trying to get more information around that we will gladly share with everybody as soon as we get some specific concrete things. So lastly is client choice. This is a huge thing. All agencies must prioritize choice in housing identification. This specifically just means, you know, if the person does not like the housing because they feel unsafe, that is an appropriate reason to move on to the next step, to the next housing. Ideally, you want to let them guide the process. Like, hey, where do you want to live? What side of town do you want? What's important to you in a unit? What nearby services are you looking for? Like, are you more worried about having to stop nearby, or are you more worried about having a grocery store nearby for you to go to, or is it closer to work or farther from work? So those are things that are really important to ask and encourage your participants to provide information on. The other important thing is that households are allowed to transfer between both projects types, between transitional housing and rapid rehousing throughout their entire duration of the program. You know, an example of why someone may step into transitional from other things when they're in the rapid is if they've maybe have a major medical emergency and all of a sudden they lose a lot of their ability to, not necessarily to the point they need assistance to function, but necessarily to have a little bit more guidance on like, hey, help me remember how to do things again. Maybe they suffered a stroke, things like that. They may not be able to fully take care of cleaning their apartment anymore. So then the goal shifts to getting them into a supportive program that they need, like a nursing home or something like that, but still keeping them housed so they don't end up back on the street. So joint services, and regardless of which type it is, case management is a requirement for both sides. At a minimum, it's meeting once a month. Again, I highly encourage you all to be flexible with that. Everyone is a little bit different, but they have to meet monthly at a minimum. So you cannot require participants to use or engage in supportive service. For example, if I'm a participant and we all know that I have a substance use problem, but I am staunchly against going to substance use treatment, is because essentially you can't force me to and be like, okay, if you don't go, we're going to pull our assistance from you. That's not allowed. The goal of the case manager should be then to engage me in like motivational interviewing, something along there, or maybe starting smaller and be like, okay, then what are you willing to work on? And then kind of building up to getting the assistance I really need. So Gustavo, I'm looking at your chat. You're not really getting penalized for not screening people in or out. That's just a general recommendation of low barrier, right? Another way to state, moving away from that statement is your intake and your enrollment process is as quick and easy as possible. You're providing assistance to help them gain their ID if they don't have it, so that they can enter the program. You're not denying someone simply because they have a felony assault charge or a substance use charge. You're not denying them services simply because they have schizophrenia and they're not on medication, or they may have severe medical issues that you just an agency may not want to deal with. That's kind of what screening in and screening out versus screening out is. You're not finding a reason to not bring them into the program. So hopefully that answers your question. So here are just some suggested services for the joint types. Employment assistance, connection to mainstream benefits, housing search assistance, financial counseling. I mean, I can go down the full list of potential case management services that one should provide, but these are just kind of some basic ones that the written standards expanded a little bit more. If you're CoC funded, the CoC interim rule actually expands that even further than our written standards, because we're just kind of using suggested services and not the full list. So when it comes to rent, this is only for rapid rehousing only, not the joint side. Rent must be reasonable if it is over fair market value, meaning you want to see what the average cost of rent is in your area, especially if your area, maybe like Austin or San Antonio areas where it's just too high. Their rent is higher than their fair market value. The household must have a lease prior to agencies paying for the rent, so you can't just go ahead and jump into it and say, here, I'm paying for the total amount right now without a lease being signed. Eligible use of funds can include paying first and last month's rent, property damage up to 1 month. That can be helpful to let the landlords know, so that if they have some concerns and reservation about renting the unit out, that they are covered up to 1 month of property damage. And then security deposits, and I see that I didn't put it in there, but security deposit up to 2 months of rent. So leasing, this is specifically for the transitional housing side of things. This must be calculated using what is considered the maximum charge allowable using the CoC interim rule 578.77B. I will not go into that. It's outside the scope today. I do have a training video on PSH and transitional housing calculation that you're welcome to look at on our YouTube channel. But it's in there on the interim rule. We have other trainings on it. It goes into depth on what that looks like. Households must have, in this case, households must have at least 1 month, but it's automatically renewable up to 24 months, where rapid rehousing, the minimum is 12 months lease. So the eligible use of funds here is vacancy payments. So let's say you having struggle trying to find someone to come into your program, you're able to pay the rent of the unit for as long as it's empty. You'll just need to document your attempts to try and fill the unit. Again, security deposits up to 2 months, and then first and last month's rent as well. Again, this isn't a whole exhaustive list of usable funds. You just want to make sure you check our written standards in the interim rule as well. And that's it for me. I'm going to hand it over to Billy.
Thanks, Dusty. Just a quick overview, just real quick back with the monitoring strategy. The main purpose of that is that a lot of these are, if you're a CoC program grantee for sure, a lot of those elements are things that you're familiar with already, that you've seen. Hopefully, though, having that strategy included in our written standards might provide some of the context. And we always try to communicate as best as possible, kind of the purpose and the reason why we started quarterly performance scorecard or so forth. But having the monitoring strategy within the written standards, hopefully, again, provides that context for you of seeing, okay, yeah, there's quarterly performance scorecards. There's a purpose and reason and rationale behind the monitoring strategies and methods that we use. So hopefully that will be self-explanatory for you. We also have an internal monitoring strategies video that we just posted on the YouTube video as well, for that part that Dusty was explaining for internal monitoring. And so please go view that we have listed. It is an older training that was done, and we trimmed it out of an hour-and-a-half video to hopefully make it a little bit more bite-sized for you on being able to go in and review your own data. So thanks, Dusty. So we'll move on to the next part of the presentation. And I want to give just a refresher and overview real quick of kind of what is guiding where a lot of these decisions were made for these updates. So quick refresher on Violence Against Women Act. It is a federal law that in part provides housing protections for people applying for or living in units subsidized by the federal government and who have experienced domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking to help keep them safe and reduce their likelihood of experiencing homelessness. So just law trying to provide housing protections for survivors of gender-based violence. Next slide, please. So some of these protections, not going to go into the detail of outlining every one of them. We're going to end up just naturally going over a couple of these that are related to the updates. But just to give a broad overview of some of these protections under the Violence Against Women Act, you have the prohibition against entering personally identifiable information in shared databases. Those are the confidentiality protections, the requirement of emergency transfer plans to be in place, documentation requirements, notification of VAWA protections that hopefully in your projects you're already providing to every survivor that comes into your project, the housing protections in accordance with VAWA, prohibition against eviction and denial of admission or support, VAWA lease language, and lease bifurcation and removal. And so like I said, some of these we'll actually go into a little more detail on. I think it's real important to tell you about who VAWA is for. So we go to the next slide. VAWA is, the people who are protected under VAWA are survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. But real important for us to share that it's survivors of any gender identity, or sexual orientation. Despite the name of the law, it is not only protecting women, but survivors of any gender identity, or sexual orientation. Next slide, please. All right, so Violence Against Women Act, I believe, was enacted in 2013. And so then on March 15th, 2022, Congress enacted the 2022 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. So here moving forward, I will refer to this as VAWA 2022, just to keep it short and to not get tongue-tied, saying the full thing all the time. Under VAWA 2022, there were expanded and enhanced housing protections. For the purpose of this webinar today, I'm not going to go into all these protections. I just have these 2 bullet points. That there was an expanded definition of domestic violence and an amended Category 4 definition of homelessness that is more trauma inclusive. If you're interested in going into all of the changes and a comprehensive review of all that, there is a link that we are providing here in the slide presentation. Marcel can share it in the chat as well. But yes, feel free to dig into that if you want to look into more details on all of the changes made through VAWA 2022. Next slide, please. All right, so updates for our written standards then in relation to VAWA 2022. We have the adoption of the amended Category 4 definition. And so this is on page 72 in Appendix A. So as Dusty talked about through the Joint Transitional Housing Rapid Rehousing project, that within that project, eligibility is determined through anyone who's categorized under Category 1 homelessness or Category 4 homelessness. So that's what we're getting into here is the eligibility and the homeless criteria that you can take. So Category 4, there was an amended definition. This is also referenced throughout the whole document. But what it was is every reference beforehand, before these updates, every reference to a definition within the document kind of had the federal regulation. And what we've done is we've just kind of changed it to generally say homeless references Appendix A. And then in Appendix A, you'll see the federal regulations. We're just trying to keep a little more uniformity throughout the whole written standards document. All right. And then we have the addition of emergency transfer plans section. I'll discuss a little bit more in a bit, but that can be found on pages 62 and 63 of the updated written standards. And then also linked on page 63, we have the actual Texas Balanced Estate Continuum Care Emergency Transfer Plan. So I'll kind of explain the difference of this in a bit and make sense of that for you. All right, so the amended Category 4 definition that is being adopted. So we're going to read through this, but just to let you know, anything that is not underlined and in bold is the original version of Category 4 definition. Everything that is underlined in bold and italicized is the amended version. So any individual or family who, 1, is experiencing trauma or a lack of safety related to, or fleeing or is attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or other dangerous, traumatic, or life-threatening conditions related to the violence against the individual or a family member in the individual's or family's current housing situation, including where the health and safety of children are jeopardized. So this part of the definition is trying to bring trauma and realizing that survivors face a lot of nuanced situations, and it's so much broader than just having to physically flee, but there's more to survivors of gender-based violence and them needing to seek safe housing than just the physical act. So this is much more trauma inclusive. And there's a little more language that was added there regarding the health and safety of children being jeopardized as well. And then 2, has no other safe residence. So the word safe was added there. And 3, lack the resources to obtain other safe permanent housing. So the word safe was added here as well. But then also they removed, after the word resources, it used to say like the resources or support networks to obtain other permanent housing. So, or support networks was removed, likely to broaden the net more, and trying to not cause any unnecessary restrictions for survivors in ways with that particular clause being there. So, next slide, please. So, what does this mean about adopting this amended Category 4 definition? So HUD is required to engage in rulemaking to implement the amended Category 4 definition for CoC and ESG programs. Now, HUD has not yet released the rulemaking, meaning kind of them actually releasing a notice telling all of you to update your policies and procedures and so forth, but HUD has given permission for CoCs to go ahead and adopt and implement this amended Category 4 definition, even prior to HUD releasing the official rulemaking. And so if implemented, this means that we are to update our relevant written standards and policies. And so that's where you see now in this updated version, the reference that I gave you in Appendix A, we have changed the language and have adopted the amended Category 4 definition. So what this means for y'all is that you likewise will go ahead and update your policies and procedures to reflect this new amended Category 4 definition as well. And so you're welcome to use, go look and find it within the HUD references, but also our written standards, you can see the language there in Appendix A to be able to use to make that change within your policies and procedures for your projects. Right, next slide. Oh, and also just for there is, and Marcel, if you can put, I think he might have already, if you can put the link that I have there, it can be helpful for y'all to see. There is it might be a little bit later in the presentation. Yeah, you can wait until slide 24, Marcel. Sorry, y'all. We'll share the link here in a bit. So let's move along. So emergency transfer plan updates. Okay, so a section was added to the written standards for emergency transfer plan. Y'all, before we added this section, I noticed that our emergency transfer plan was, in my opinion, found through an obscure link on page 20 of our CoC's governance charter. So it was there. It was available, but it felt like it was just not very easy to find and didn't feel really accessible. So we made the decision that we wanted to try to make the emergency transfer plan more upfront, more accessible and easy to find when you're needing this resource, and be able to follow this process. And so the section in the written standards is not the official emergency transfer plan. We didn't want to add 10 to 12 pages to the written standards. And so what it is in the written standards is just an explanation of what the emergency transfer plan is, and then a list of the sections of what is contained within the emergency transfer plan. Then below that on page 63, you can see the link to the CoC's full emergency transfer plan documents, as well as an attachment for a model emergency plan, which we'll discuss in a bit. So hopefully that helps make sense of kind of what's happening with the section in the written standards. It's really just trying to make it more accessible and easily located for all projects that need to utilize the emergency transfer plan. And then we actually updated our CoC's emergency transfer plan documents to reflect the flexibilities that were allowed through VAWA 2022. And I want to take some time to be able to show y'all what those updates are. Even though technically that full document is not within our written standards, I want y'all to be aware of what those changes are that were made. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is an emergency transfer plan? So quick refresher, just like we did with Violence Against Women Acts. The emergency transfer plan is a process for transferring a tenant in your projects in a CoC or ESG funded housing project to a new safe housing unit if their current unit has become unsafe due to one of two reasons: a threat of imminent harm, a further violence, or an occurrence of sexual assault. There's a little more detail to that, but that's essentially what the emergency transfer plan is seeking to resolve. Next slide, please. So what is the emergency transfer plan requirement? All right, so Marcel, if you can share that link that's in there. This kind of can help you all see where some of this language comes from. If you're a CoC program recipient versus an ESG recipient, this document is very helpful with what those requirements are. But CoC and ESG housing providers are required to allow participants to request an emergency transfer and help with the process. And so that is the emergency transfer plan. For the CoC, CoCs must develop a plan to facilitate those transfers. And the policy applies to all housing programs in the Texas Balanced and State Continuum of Care. So we encourage all recipients, even if you're not federally funded housing project in the Continuum of Care, to utilize our emergency transfer plan. However, CoC program recipients must implement the CoC's emergency transfer plan, and failure to do so could put funding and the client safety at risk. Sherry, I see a question that, let me go through. If they are still living with the abuser. Yes. I mean, there's nuances to that, but yes, they still can be considered for rapid rehousing assistance. Yeah, I won't go into all the details and nuances of that, but I guess just on, correct me if I'm wrong, Dusty, but yeah, just on the surface level of that question, the answer would be yes.
Yeah,
so,
the key would, oops, sorry, Billy.
Oh, go ahead.
So in generally speaking, yes, they would qualify, but they must still be making an attempt, like a goal is to flee. The issue around doing it while they're with their abuser is just safety takes precedence. So kind of explaining hey, there's a safety risk for this. Strongly encouraging them maybe going to a domestic violence shelter, or they have friends or families they could stay out even just temporarily, so that you could then prioritize finding housing as quickly as possible. Usually they can qualify.
And I think is your question, is that the cost for the emergency for the process of emergency transfer? Does the program cover that? Is that what the question was? I think so, yeah. Yeah, I'll come back to that question if you can clarify that for a bit. But then for ESG grantees, the recipients must, okay, thanks, Andrea. Recipients must develop an emergency transfer plan. So here's my understanding and the link that we provide that kind of shares these requirements are outlined there. But technically, the ESG recipients don't have to follow the CoC's emergency transfer plan, but they must develop their own emergency transfer plan that covers their entire service area. So if you don't So you don't have to adopt our emergency transfer plan that you're seeing here, but you must, if you don't already, under Violence Against Women Act, you must develop your own emergency transfer plan. But you're welcome to use the COC's emergency transfer plan as yours if that's what you want to implement. And so the last bullet I have here is that, well, I'll discuss this more in detail, but if you are wanting to use our COC plan, we have a model emergency transfer plan of attachment E that we will discuss a little bit later.
And real quick, I'm having to update the ESG written standards template that we provide ESG recipients. I will be including a copy of the new emergency transfer plan in there as well.
Cool. Thanks, Jesse. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the updated COC emergency transfer plan. So HUD and VAWA 2022 allow flexibilities for COCs to allow room to better serve survivors that's just beyond the minimum requirements that must be met. And that's, it is a value and a priority for our COC to serve survivors with best practices and as best as we can. And so we always seek to go beyond the minimum requirements with our emergency transfer plan. So the process that we took is that we researched, through training on VAWA 2022 and the flexibilities, we also researched what other COCs have been doing with their emergency transfer plans in light of VAWA 2022, in particular, other balance of state continuums of care. I mean, how we can incorporate VAWA 2022 expansions within our emergency transfer plan that works for our COC geography. So revisions were made in light of this research and training. And then we solicited for feedback from Texas Council on Family Violence, Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, grantees across the balanced state geography, as well as family violence service providers or victim service providers. A lot of times we'll say VSPs, which that is the language for, I guess in the HUD language is victim service providers, but more in the gender-based violence world and family violence world, it's family violence service providers. But we solicited feedback from all these and we incorporated that feedback into the version that you see today. Next slide, please. So some of the sample areas of flexibility. We did not adopt all of these sample areas that are allowed. There's only a few, but just want to give you an idea of some of the flexibilities that VAWA 2022 allows for COCs to utilize. For example, incorporating other programs into the emergency transfer plan process, defining minimum standards for emergency transfer plan request processing times, requiring service providers to engage in safety planning as part of emergency transfer plan requests, extending the window for reporting a sexual assault beyond 90 days, and creating an external transfer process within local coordinated entry system. So let's look into decisions that we ended up making. So there's a couple of different categories I'm going to discuss real quick of what these updates look like in our COC's emergency transfer plan. First, there are updates that are made to existing sections that were already in place prior to these updates. So the sections already exist. We just made some updates within them. The other category are some new sections that have been added that were not there before. So let's start with the existing sections. You can see 6 sections there that have been updated. And I'm not going to list all of them because you're going to see them in the slides, but I am going to say that for this first one, the section 1 was originally just emergency transfers, but now it's emergency transfers and relevant definitions because as you see from the next slide, we have added some relevant definitions to this section. So let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so these relevant definitions is just some really important terms that we feel like it helps to provide a clarification. Internal transfer and external transfer are always outlined in the emergency transfer plan, but it just is hopefully helpful in section 1 to have those defined. The internal transfer being just if your project is able to move someone requesting an emergency transfer to what we consider an internal unit, which means that they don't have to be categorized as a new applicant. They don't have to go through the whole new application process. It can just be quickly executed and just move them to internal unit. So that's internal transfer. And then our emergency transfer plan outlines that if an internal transfer is not available, immediately move on to seeking an external transfer, which would be looking for another unit that would require the tenant to be categorized as a new applicant and would have to go through the whole application process again, which of course, makes it harder to guarantee what the timing of an emergency transfer can look like. And so just to be able to make that distinction and clarification in that section 1, outlining those definitions. And we also added a definition for personally identifiable information. I'm just kind of looking into confidentiality protections you'll see later in that section. This is some of the updates that were made per the feedback from subject matter experts on serving survivors, to be able to really outline and emphasize the priority of protecting personally identifiable information. And we added definition for safe units. The purpose of this is really, according to VAWA, the definition for safe unit is that the survivor is the only one who can determine what is safe. I mean, what a safe unit is. And so really adding this definition is, the spirit of it is to emphasize survivor choice and empowerment as the best practice as you serve survivors. And then we added domestic violence in section 1. It's not the entire definition that you would find within the regulations, but it's more just emphasizing the fact that VAWA 2022 expanded the domestic violence definition in numerous ways, but we really wanted to make light that it's including additional types of abuse other than just physical and sexual abuse, and looking at verbal, psychological, economic, and technological abuse, and just seeing that there's so many more nuances to gender-based violence and domestic violence as you're seeking to serve survivors and paying attention to those nuances. All right, next slide, please. So the next section that was updated is the eligibility for emergency transfers section. So you'll see there, it's the whole outlining of eligibility is there. I'm not even going to for training. I just, again, want to make you aware of what's changed. So you see that emergency transfers can be requested from victims of gender-based violence who are requesting a transfer for one of two reasons. The tenant reasonably believes there is a threat of imminent harm or further violence. And so there is some language changes on that first section that's emphasizing the additional types of abuse that just discussed of like economic and technological abuse, but it also adds some language that states that a tenant does not need to provide evidence to verify reasonable belief. And so we feel like the subject matter experts and through feedback, but that was important to be able to state within this section on the reasonable belief part, that a tenant does not need to provide evidence to verify that reasonable belief. And then with the sexual assault side, one of the flexibilities, as you saw earlier, of one of the simple areas was to consider extending the 90-day time period. So what our emergency transfer plan said before regarding eligibility is that one of the reasons to request transfer would be that a sexual assault occurred on the premises 90 days preceding the emergency transfer request. According to the subject matter experts and the feedback we received, there's many reasons that a sexual assault survivor would wait 90 days, if not more, to actually disclose that sexual assault occurred on the premises. And so for trauma-informed best practices, the decision was made to not only extend that time frame, but just to go ahead and remove that time period altogether. So it just states that the sexual assault has to have occurred on the premises preceding the emergency transfer request, with no time frame put on that. So those are the differences in the eligibility for emergency transfer section. All right, next slide. Transfer request documentation, this can be a confusing section, so I just want to highlight just some of the differences. Now, of course, when an emergency transfer request is made, the tenant must submit a written request, and there's a HUD document that can be used for that. They don't have to use the HUD document. But what we've changed in here is that a provider, we don't necessarily recommend this, but a provider may request additional documentation to verify an emergency transfer request and that gender-based violence did occur or is at risk of occurring. And so this section, we now provide a more detailed list of what those additional types of documentation may be. But we also add language, a sentence that providers cannot require more than one form of documentation from that more detailed list. Which that was already always in place, but our feedback loop and subject matter experts felt that it was important to really make that explicit, that one form documentation could not be required. The removal of the 90-day limitation on sexual assault occurring that I just mentioned is also reflected here in this section, just to make sure that uniformity is there. And then we've also added paragraphs regarding landlords requesting proof and guidelines when additional information is requested. So hopefully that's just, again, helpful if there's questions with landlords to be able to help through the documentation process of an emergency transfer. The next section. So looking at confidentiality protections, this section was expanded to explicitly emphasize the protection of personally identifiable information, hence why we added that relevant definition in section 1. Also in confidentiality protections, there's additional language added at the recommendation of our subject matter experts to enhance survivor protection. And then there's also, that one's pretty simple on the confidentiality protections, but just want to make you aware of that. The emergency transfer timing and availability. This one's going to be a little bit bigger change that you might not have been used to. Before, there was no defined time frame or required time frame for any part of the process of emergency transfer plan. Under the recommendation of those who serve survivors, that's not very trauma informed. You know, when someone is seeking safe unit and they're concerned for their safety and they're trying to give this it helps to have at least there to be a little more accountability on the providers, but also there to be some semblance of what can be expected of a time frame. So any requirement that was added is this first one, is that housing providers are now required to accept or reject emergency transfer requests within 5 business days. So this is not to process an emergency transfer plan or emergency transfer within 5 business days. It's just to accept or reject it. And it's not even, within 5 business days. But then whenever you do have an approved emergency transfer request, we did add this preferable time frame of 10 business days. So before it said there's no guarantee of how long an emergency transfer process can take. That language is still there, but we added this just as a trauma-informed practice to add that 10 business days is a preferable time frame to process an approved emergency transfer request. Again, this is to kind of help the survivor to have some semblance of an expectation, but also hopefully hold providers a little bit more accountable to try to keep that ball rolling as quickly as possible through the process of an emergency transfer. Safety and security of participants. This section, very easy changes that were made there. The Texas VSP directory map was added. There's a link there. I want to remind y'all, if y'all have not seen this, I feel like it's a wonderful tool that I love. And I did it in partnership with Texas Council on Family Violence. They have a statewide directory. And so using their statewide directory, I just kind of put it through our lens as a COC. We serve 214 counties, and so there's only 40 counties left. So we just went ahead and just finished the whole state of Texas with their directory and not just the balance of state. But this is going to be there to be able to help y'all as well as your participants, to where if they're needing to find the most local victim service provider, you can search your county and be able to find hopefully what the most local and nearest local victim service provider that would be available. So that was added to the safety and security of participants section, as well as added language that emphasizes that contacting law enforcement is the survivor's choice and may not always be the safest option. So again, that was language that was added at the request of our subject matter experts. And then, yeah, slide 34, Dusty. Oh, no, 35.
It's taking a second. Sorry.
Oh, it's all right. So the next section we're gonna discuss this. So that was changes to all the existing sections, and so now we're gonna be looking at what are the newly added sections to our emergency transfer plan. I'm not even going into detail on these because they can get very complicated. So I will say this: these new sections 7, 8, and 9, excuse me, these are sections that are already outlined in, I think it's called HUD form 5382. And I totally could be butchering that number. But it's basically, yeah, Leanne, we'll share the PowerPoint presentation with y'all once we have it available in the next couple of days. But when you provide the VAWA housing protections to your project participants and who do categorize as category 4, those protections, this section 7, 8, and 9 are already within those protections. So really all we're doing is we're just be able to reiterate those several of these protections that are very linked and applicable to emergency transfers into the emergency transfer plan, just to kind of have that be in the forefront. Okay, so section 7 is the prohibited basis for denial or termination of assistance of eviction. So slide 36. Dusty, this is essentially all it's doing is it's just a reminder that housing providers may not deny assistance or admission, terminate assistance, or evict on the basis of, or as a direct result of gender-based violence, essentially, or criminal activity directly related to gender-based violence. And there's also an exception for, again, this is at the recommendation of Texas Council on Family Violence to include this section of outlining the exception for landlords to evict, only if an actual or imminent threat exists to other tenants or employees that can be demonstrated. But also the language is there to not evict if possible, that to use alternatives to eviction as a best practice and a strong encouragement. So that's section 7. Section 8 is the lease bifurcation. Again, this very complicated. It's in our emergency transfer plan now, but this is the idea: is if the best option seems to be to try to keep the tenant, the survivor within the current unit, and that is what is deemed the safe unit. Lease bifurcation is sometimes needed to actually kind of either remove or evict the perpetrator from the lease and from the unit. So this is one of the VAWA protections that is allowed under the Violence Against Women Act, and so just wanted to be able to have that section available in the emergency transfer plan if that ends up being a method that ends up determined as the best way to move forward. And there's also the information there, again, that if the perpetrator was the member of the household with eligibility for the program, it kind of shares the time frame and the guidelines of working on that. So that is section 8. And then section 9 is kind of sharing the leases, subleases, and occupancy agreements. And so it's the relationships and kind of what's occurring between all the different parties of the emergency transfer plan that's occurring. So between the tenant and the housing provider must permit termination without penalty if an emergency transfer is approved. Between the housing provider and the landlord, there must be a contract between the provider and the landlord in which the landlord agrees to uphold all the VAWA protections for any tenants receiving HUD assistance. And then between the tenant and the landlord, there's a lease addendum that should be being included that shares the prohibited, essentially section 7 and section 8 that we just discussed, the prohibited bases for eviction and the allowance of lease bifurcation in the case of an emergency transfer. And then we have attachment E. It's kind of the last change that we have in there is that there used to just be attachments A through D. We've added attachment E, which is the model emergency transfer plan. Every provider must have an emergency transfer plan in their policies and procedures that identifies staff who will carry out emergency transfers, provide method to request emergency transfer, and sets the procedure for carrying out the emergency transfer. Our attachment E kind of meets all those points. And it's designed in a way where I can't remember the exact formatting, but I think there's sections that are like in bold and in parentheses that you would edit and change. So if you do use our attachment E, I do encourage y'all to tailor it specifically for your project and for your agency, to where it says agency name, you're putting your agency name, where it says applicable staff member. I don't know if that's exactly what it says, but where it's indicating who the applicable staff member should be, that you're putting in your specific title that you have within your project of the person responsible to carry out the procedure of emergency transfer. And again, to ESG recipients, please feel free also to use our attachment E for your use and to include in your policies and procedures as well. Yes, and that attachment E, we used to have, I think we did previously have a model emergency transfer plan that projects could use, but this has also been updated to align with this updated version of the emergency transfer plan. And then we just have to mention for best practices, the concept of safety planning. When it comes to emergency transfers, there's no guarantee of how, like we said, even though we put a preferable time frame now in our emergency transfer plan, there's still no guarantee of how long it will end up taking to get a survivor to a safe unit. And so therefore it is all the more critical to be including safety planning within your case management. Not even just for housing projects, just for any provider. It is so important to have safety planning as a part of your case management best practices and assessing for safety. And so back in November, we did do a safety planning webinar in partnership with Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. So if you have not seen that yet, please review that webinar. If you have, I don't think that you can refresh enough on safety planning practices. And then also just have to put in the plug that all providers should be collaborating with, and really must be collaborating with, local resources, such as domestic violence shelters, the victim service providers, the sexual assault line, rape crisis centers. That if you're not aware of, if you have a case manager that's not aware of different links or different resources, that you have that resource at hand and developed. That's where our VSP directory map that I just shared can hopefully be helpful, to where if you search that and you see a victim service provider that you weren't even aware of that is local and actually near to you, maybe in a neighboring county, if you're in a more rural county, if you haven't started building a relationship with them, we strongly encourage that you reach out and begin to develop relationships and foster collaboration with your local victim service providers, so that when you do, if that is not your level of expertise in serving survivors, that you always can have a partnership that you can lean on and reach out to whenever these questions do come up. Like this new category 4 definition, I was saying, okay, I think this qualifies as trauma, but not real sure. Those experts can be so helpful in being able to even just get really good guidance in implementing best practices for serving survivors. So there's my safety planning plug. So that is just very important. And I think, what do we have after that? Resources? Oh, Q&A.
Q&A.
Yes, please. If there's any questions, Craig, I can't remember. Feel free to put it in the chat. The additional questions. If you can raise a hand, are people able to come off of mute? I think you might be able to. We do encourage y'all to read through. Like you said, we provided this webinar, knowing that y'all are all very, very busy, and don't always have the capacity. I know that there's lots of things that are on my list to read, and it just keeps getting pushed. And so we completely understand that. And that was one of the purposes of us holding this webinar. But we do encourage you to read through these changes and make yourself familiar and aware of them when you do have the capacity to read through those.
Oh, we have some questions, Billy.
Yeah, Sherry, we attachment E, there's a couple of different things. If I open up, I know that you can on page 63 of the written standards document that was linked, and it's on our website as well. I think it's on page 63. Yeah, you can see there's underneath at the end of the emergency transfer plan section, there's a link for the actual COC's emergency transfer plan, and then below that there's a link for attachment E, model emergency transfer plan for housing providers. But then also within the actual emergency transfer plan document itself, you can find attachment E at the end of the whole document. But I wanted to have a standalone link in here as well, so that you can already have an attachment that is separated from the bigger document if you actually wanted to. And I think that I'm going to click it right now. I believe that the link in the written standards for attachment E is a Microsoft Word version as well. That hopefully will make it easier for you to actually take and begin to actually edit and make your own. All right, what do we got here, Andrea?
So to expand on what I was talking about, or Billy and I were talking about with category 4, with an individual still living with their abuser, I had to find my notes because I needed to look up that a while back for another agency. But basically, because of the expanded definition, it allows agencies to serve individuals still with their abuser because of the lack of permanent housing, safe permanent housing added to the definition, as well as the specific section where it goes. Oh, let me see on the PowerPoint. Where that is slide 20. So let me pull that up real quick. So basically it's allowed because one, if they have no other safe residence, so like if they can't stay permanently with friends or family, or do not have the resources to attain safe permanent housing. In some cases, individuals have abuse where it's economic abuse as well as physical or emotional or psychological, but also the definition here in section 1 being expanded to is experiencing trauma or lack of safety related to, as well as specifically in the current, where it says in the individual's or family's current housing situation. So it doesn't mean they have to be, they need to remove themselves from the house. They just have to be experiencing a situation.
These are good questions. These are questions that we'll have to answer. Of the eligibility to the project in general. Yeah.
Yeah, Andre, it's more, safety is much broader. Like
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very specific, that's a very personal question. What makes me feel unsafe could make Billy be like, I don't feel unsafe. So it's very unique to their situations.
Yeah, George, we might wait on that question because there's a lot. I mean, Justin, unless you want to go for it, there's, we housing first practices we can share as best practices, but that's, yeah.
So were you talking about John's question, Billy? So John was saying if the abuser is the head of household,
Yeah.
would then the abused member of the household become a separate client if chosen path to safety?
Yes, that would be, and that's where least bifurcation would come in some of the cases. It gets very complicated, where you would remove, where if they, it would depend, and then things change depending on who ends up staying in the units, right? If the survivor ends up staying, then there would need to be kind of the, there's the guidelines of time frame of getting them to become eligible again and transfer to and find other housing. And then vice versa, if they're staying in the unit, I think unless they have actually broken, and I know that gets complicated and these get very complicated situations, but that's where you're looking at lease violations and so forth, where, it gets complicated if there isn't technical lease violations that occurred. Yeah, hopefully that's kind of answering the question, for you vaguely.
Doris, with your question, can you give an example of a situation where eligibility can be denied or terminated? Is that in response to like the eligibility requirements of joint, or in relations to like VAWA? So towards VAWA, I believe this is more your area of expertise.
Yeah, I'll get back to you on that one, Doris. I don't want to share right off the bat. So like I said, again, those things where um things get easily open to interpretation. There's so many different scenarios and nuances that come for it. So off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of an explicit example. And so I want to be mindful of that, and not say something that somebody will send me an email afterwards and be like, whoa, that was wrong. But yes, no, that's a great question, Doris, and we can follow up with you on that one.
I mean, for termination of assistance, HUD's very big on being the last resort. So we're talking like these would be egregious situations, where the survivors maybe attacked a staff member or threatening to attack a staff member. I mean, even the threats that can go either way of keeping them or not, just depending on the situation. But those would have to be like severe, egregious situation, and that's not just within working with those experiencing domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. It's with any program type. The termination is like for the egregious behaviors.
Yeah, and we're usually really careful of just, given explicit examples and everything. Normally, the practice that we hold as the COC is that when a project is needing to consider termination or denying assistance, that they just reach out to us and we were able to staff it and workshop it with y'all and provide what guidance we can, just because it's very much a case by case basis, rather than being able to provide a list of specific examples, if that makes sense. We there are projects sometimes that try to provide a list of examples that would merit a termination and so forth, but then we do know other agencies and other guidance that says to kind of be wary of that, because it can very much be a case by case scenario. There are some explicit things that occur at times, but yes, if you're out in the project, the best thing to do always is reach out to us and we workshop it with you and staff it and just kind of go through the questions and provide that support.
So Gustavo says, I know we have no boundaries in our programs. We had a potential tenant who wanted us to assist them and their partner while claiming VAWA. Would there be anything we could do or enforce? They have now split and she is moving into RH on her own. Like, if that's referring to like the partner, the abuser, but the individual is claiming VAWA protections, it's kind of one of those things you got to talk to the individual about. You can't help them both while at the same time with VAWA protection, because VAWA protection is only designed for the survivor or of the situation. In most cases, I've always advocated for the individual to let us help and house them separately. But again, if they choose to stay with the individual, there's not much we can do. So then it just reverts to safety planning as best as possible. I don't know if Billy, if there's more you might be able to add to that.
Yeah, Andrea asked it earlier, the safety of the client and the whole idea of defining safe units is, I know from the subject matter experts, the best practice is always the survivor choice, that it is up to them. Like I know when we did the emergency housing voucher program, we had, I think we'd have participants that, would be in a rural town and wouldn't want to leave, where sometimes you feel like, okay, well, no, I think the safest thing will be to get you further away, but well, my kids are here and I don't want them, and my job is here. And there's just, again, case by case scenarios, so many nuances where it's just really the best practice is survivor choice, and kind of letting them guide that. And there are situations where, like you saw in the language of our update, there are situations where, like, for example, the landlord can evict if there is if it can be determined and documented that there is immediate threat to other tenants and employees. There are scenarios where there can be more drastic measures taken, to kind of enforce the situation. But
So, Gustavo, with what you just last put, a lot of times they claim VAWA to get individuals claim VAWA to get bumped up on the waiting list. So typically, if they're staying with their abuser, VAWA protections kind of don't. I mean, they exist, but there's not much that can be enforced because they're staying. Um, Different if they choose to split, so that would change things. But yeah, it's hard when some individuals might claim VAWA or something when it's really not the case, and that's really hard to navigate because you can't just sit there and be the decider of that. I remember having to deal with that at several agencies I worked for, and that was it's a really hard time. But no, like Billy said, you could always reach out to us here on the planning team so that we can kind of see what's going on and how we might provide best guidance and best practices to help you all navigate those situations.
hey, Joe,
Um,
what time frame specifically, like the 24-month eligibility, does the time frame in permanent supportive housing program? Blah, blah. Not quite sure on that one, because I know there's a 24-month eligibility for rapid rehousing, but the time frame, there's no maximum amount of time for the permanent supportive housing. If you're talking about rental assistance, yeah, if you can find a little more clarification on that, and just I'm not sure if you do it, George. I didn't answer your question real quick. I'll come back to that. Of how much, I think you're talking about determination for how much documentation or notification would be required of us. Like that's again, that's a trickier one, because the regulation in the interim rule regarding termination policy is pretty bare minimum and vague for termination policy. But we provide, as Texas Homeless Network, we have a termination policy template that does follow more best practices on trying to ensure due process is occurring. And so, we normally recommend, that you have a process in place within your policies that is at minimum 30 days in advance of notifying them in writing. But that really, depending on the situation, that you're allowing there to be maybe an opportunity for a corrective action plan before moving, and having that outlined where, if in the next 30 days there's no improvement that has occurred, then we'll move forward into the termination process, that you're also allowing for an appeal process and so forth. So it kind of depends on a project, right? Because HUD does not specify what the time frame should be. They just essentially say that you're respecting the due process and rights of the participants. So agencies determine that, but we're there, we provide that template, and we're there to actually help, if you have questions in developing a termination policy, to kind of discuss best practices on that time frame.
Billy Deborah asks, oh, you saw it.
I know. Do we want to answer that, or are we going to system change land?
That would be best served, unfortunately, Deborah, by reaching out to the system change team. Some
Yeah.
communities do things a little different from each other when it comes to domestic violence. I mean, I can speak to Comel County. coordinated entry processes, specifically around that. So in those cases, we prioritized individuals experiencing domestic violence, but we also kind of, in conjunction, would keep our housing priority lists and keep moving through that. So usually the domestic violence agencies would serve the VSPs, and then occasionally they would, or not VSPs, they would serve the survivors, but occasionally they'd come in and be like, hey, we need some assistance. We don't have enough money to house this person. And then we usually try and figure out the best way to quickly move forward with them. But I would reach out to the systems change team for a little bit more better guidance on that. I'm sure I might have misspoke a few things there, and Comel was doing things completely wrong. But yeah, reach out to the systems change team so they can provide better guidance on that.
Yeah, because there's a couple ways. I mean, because as long as you're following confidentially the confidentiality protections outlined in the emergency transfer plan or in according to VAWA, like, you know, if they sign a release of information and you follow the process, I mean, you can put them in HMIS, but you could vision service providers cannot. You know, under law, they cannot enter into HMIS and use a comparable database, and they use what we call a domestic violence workaround. If they have that, if they're in their community where there's actually like a de-identified code or number that's used, and that's what ends up being seen on the housing priority list. So there are, you know, if you work with the systems change team, coordinated entry, they can help you ensure that your community kind of has something in place where they can get on a housing priority list, but you're still protecting their anonymity and using best practices while serving survivors. Yeah, John, I'm afraid I know I didn't get to your question. I wasn't real sure that my mind is catching exactly what. I'm afraid me giving an answer that's totally not answering your question because I'm misunderstanding it.
I mean, if you want, John, we can take you off mute to maybe that's a little easier to explain than trying to type it out.
No, these are great questions.
We've got about 5 minutes left, folks. So if there's any other, all right, let me take John off mute. Give me 1 second. All right, John, you should be good to go.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
We can, yes.
Okay. So we have a potential client that's been in a PSH program, got onto a stability voucher due to BAWA, and has experienced DV again and lost the voucher in the housing due to the DV. And so will potentially come onto the RRH program.
Mm-hmm.
Would the time frame that she's been in that PSH program count towards those months, that 24 months of RRH?
Oh. Ooh, that's a good question. My hunch is that it would not, because it's totally different project.
Yeah, and that's what,
It-
when I read the guidelines, I was like, okay, it doesn't look like that counts towards. I just wanted to make sure before we move forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, that shouldn't affect anything. Are they both from the same funding stream, like COC funded? I know you have a rapid
Yeah, they're
rehousing
both
program.
CLC funded. Well, the
Okay.
PSH and the RRHR, but obviously the stability voucher came through the housing authority,
Sure.
but
Mhm.
came through HUD, and our goal is to hopefully see if we can get that stability voucher back.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I
that
think
shouldn't.
you still utilize progressive engagement and everything, right? But my hunch is that that would be unrelated. There would be a different project type, a different project that they're being entered into, and that the clock would start like any other rapid rehousing enrollments.
Yeah, would start over.
Mhm. That would, and we can verify that, of course. Don't take, that's why we're careful with these answering questions over webinar. Don't take our word as gospel. Please hear us that we're not HUD. And so we're always giving you our best interpretation of what there is through the guidelines and everything. So So we can verify that for you and follow up though as well, John, to make sure that we didn't provide anything incorrect. But I have not ever been given any inclination that you would start them like in the middle of a time clock based on how much permanent supportive housing assistance that they had already received.
Yeah, I felt like when I read the CFR that they were almost like totally different, you know what I mean? Like programmatic, when you read it, it never talks about on RH that you're looking at any time frame previous. You're just looking at that programmatic time frame.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's different if they're a former rapid rehousing participant coming back into the program. I mean, that, there's more nuances probably in that kind of situation, but
Right. So like if they had been in our program and then exited our program and then come back into our program, it would put difficulty on the time frames.
but potentially, but maybe not. Like, it depends, right? Kind of, if they're
We'd have to
fully
look
exited
into
from the program.
We'd have to look into that real quick because I know with ESG funded rapid rehousing, you get 2 years out of every 3 years.
Mhm.
So there's
I'm
like
not
a time frame when the clock starts over.
For
and at
ESG
least
for sure.
ESG. I need to
Okay.
double check for the COC because no one's actually asked me that question. I don't think anyone's asked us that question before. I would be surprised if there wasn't like a time frame, especially if somebody hit their 2-year mark, and then 6 months later they become homeless and they're trying to get services again. So let us do some research on that, and we'll send you an email on that, John.
Okay,
Yeah.
that'd be good, especially since like we have another household that's already in program that had been in PSH long time ago and then exited into like a prison setting and then eventually released back into the same community and is in RRH right now.
No, that's good. You always got good questions for us. Keep us keep us employed. So we appreciate that. So yeah, and Doris, I was gonna answer this. I know we're at our time. The funding release, yes and no. There are grants are being processed, but they're going through like waves. I did end up hearing from a hub regional office, they had received word for a wave 1. Some new grantees have received an award letter that I don't know. I think everybody could get an award letter as far as I understand. Not like the issues and conditions going towards a grant agreement, but just that initial award letter. My understanding, and again, my word is not gospel, but my understanding is that the different HUD regional offices all have those award letters, but there's so many of them, and it like comes in one big PDF that they don't have the capacity to parse out each individual letter. They may not have sent that out to everybody yet. But when it comes to actually receiving the email that's called the issues and conditions that talks about the next steps towards getting towards the grant agreement, that's where things are still moving pretty slowly. There's a wave 1 of grants that were prioritized with earlier expiration dates. And as far as I've heard, the next, I don't know if they're calling them waves or not, but that wave 2 or whatever it's going to be has not yet been released from HUD yet to the regional offices. And they didn't have any idea of when they'll share it. And they don't have any idea if that wave 2 is going to include new grantees or if it's going to still be renewals. They just don't know yet. So again, yeah, like I said, yes and no on the updates for funding release. No, yeah, for sure, y'all. If you don't have to go, we totally understand. We're at the 12:02 time. We'll stick around for a few more minutes if anyone wants to stick around and ask questions. But yes, there's resources there. We will share the slide presentation with you on the next couple of days, as well as recording when we have it available. And so you can have this with you. But yes, please see the resources and the links that will be in this slide presentation. And then we'll stick around for a few more minutes if anybody has additional questions. Thanks, y'all.